topic of vulnerability is one that is often shaky, and many men in particular have questions about. And it only heightens when in the pursuit of romantic relationships. Today, we react to a dating coach by the name of Matthew Hussey. Gives his take and insight on women wanting men to be vulnerable and men being extremely hesitant due to past experiences being crushed from their vulnerability.
Tell him I got the juice.
What about to the men who say, I've heard stories like your one, where a woman says that they love the idea of me opening up, and the second that they do, they see me as the beta male underling that I've always feared that they might do. It maybe confirms my concerns that I have about being insufficient. Therefore, I'm going to lock this away.
Yeah. Or I say these things and they think I'm awful. You know, there's things that I'm going to say to you that I don't normally say because I think they're a part of my past that I don't like.
Yeah, so definitely comment below if this is an experience that you have. Are you coming from a place where you've been vulnerable with others and it didn't really work out too well? And so it's kind of created this mantra like I'm just never going to do it. And it just makes me feel insufficient in some kind of way. And I definitely get where he's coming from with a lot of this. And again, stick to the end because I've got just some interesting thoughts to just maybe tie into the topic of vulnerability and even some scripture that kind of helps us really know the tone to set in vulnerability, or at least who sets that tone for us in the relationships that we're trying to navigate. But I definitely can understand it. And it's definitely understandable, right? You were vulnerable and somebody wasn't really too receiving of it, started looking at you differently, and maybe even went to the lengths of removing you from their life, cutting you off. And that kind of becomes the worst fear. But what Matthew Hussey is about to share, I think is really, really good.
And you're going to now think I'm villainous. You know, there's that too. And that's 100% going to happen with some people. 100%. There are going to be people you come up against who you tell them something from your past and they go, you're awful. Who doesn't have something that they look back on and go, I really to someone. I really was mean to someone. I regret that deeply.
And that's the human heart, man. I'm not going to pause it too much, y'all. I know, but I'm just saying it's the human heart. It's the human heart. I think as believers, one of the things that ought to always keep us wrapped up in humility is looking at ourselves and knowing that we too have done things and made decisions that were not only of our best interests, but were in some way, shape, or form, or at least were in some cases ashamed and we're not proud of. And this is what helps us respond to other messiness that's presented to us, the past that we learn from other people, the compromises that other people have made. We don't look at that and look to destroy it. We look at that and go, man, I hear you. And you know what's crazy? We're not that far apart because I've made some pretty rough compromises too. Maybe not in the same areas, but potentially with the same heart posture, just towards something different.
Should never have done this. I should never have done that. But what we want is to be able to meet someone in life who can make space for those parts of us. And to the guys that say there are women who say they want vulnerability, and then as soon as I actually cry, not cute cry, they're out. I don't think there's someone who is capable of having a real relationship. I think that's a woman who says that she wants a real relationship, but hasn't grown enough to truly understand men. And truly understanding men might be understanding that there are some things you will or won't like. And also that there are parts of him that are very much not different from you at all. And if you're looking for someone who's bulletproof and strong all the time, then there's some growing up to do.
Well, there will be men out there that are like that.
That are bulletproof?
Yeah, there are men out there. I have a number of friends that range from totally emotional to completely unemotional. And some of them that are completely unemotional, I believe that that's actually how they are. That there is a degree of ease with their emotions. They just don't seem to hold on to things. Things don't seem to affect them in as deep of a way as some of my other friends. So I suppose that there is a market for each different type of person. If you're a guy who is super emotional, if you're one who has vulnerabilities, issues from your past, you need to work on finding a partner who is going to be able to accept that.
Well, that
1000%. I love that. Now, granted, I don't necessarily know if I've met too many people, maybe like Chris has, where they're just completely unemotional. I definitely would subscribe to the thought that there's a reason behind that. And it may be who they are, but it's not somebody they've always been potentially. Because I do believe that in a lot of ways we're emotional human beings. And so I'm not saying that because they don't show emotion that, you know, they have no soul or anything like that. I'm not going that far. But I do think that for somebody to get to the place of being unemotional, I do think there's a story that could be worth hearing and listening to that might give us better perspective and context to how they got there. and maybe where to move on from there. So I haven't met people like that. Let me know in the comments if you have, if you are someone who's like that. But I do agree that I do think there is a market for everybody in there. And you guys have to keep in mind too, just especially coming from a Christian worldview, there is no one like you. Like you're so unique. God created you so uniquely down to your fingerprint. There's not a matching fingerprint that is a reflection or a mirror or an exact, you know, replica build version of you. You are unique. God loves you uniquely. It is amazing. And so I think we have to come away from the idea, and a lot of it can come from self-sabotaging places, because that's also what I think about when hearing that statement. Because there's a lot of people who think, man, well, will I always be single? Is there anybody that's really out there for me? And then you kind of start rabbit holing down to this self-sabotaging type mindset, which again is a paradigm that you have to be willing to rewire. And because you're going to step into spaces where you're hearing new things, and it's going to stretch your subconscious, but your subconscious is going to snap right back. And so we've talked about all that before here on this channel, but you have to be willing to recognize that you are unique in your own way, as God has designed you, aligned in God's creation, aligned in biblical principles, aligned in those understandings. He loves you uniquely, 1000%. And so there is a market for everybody, and it's always been about finding the right person. The question has always been, though, how do we go about finding that right person? And obviously throughout this podcast, and maybe you've thought about it too, maybe it's through attraction, it's through status, it's through all this physical gain and wealth, and you've heard all these kinds of different answers that people give. But if you ask me, I think the best way to determine that is first having a relationship with God, your creator, calling, and capacity, right? Because this is actually what's going to catapult you to find that right person, because you're already aligned in the right places that would make sense for the person you end up meeting and deciding to go long term pursue a marriage with. Like that's what makes room for it, right? And of course there's so many other things to think about, but I really don't know who the right person is for me if I really don't know my assignment in my life, if I'm unfamiliar with it, if I don't have a relationship with God, if I don't have a foundation and values and beliefs, if I don't have identity in something that is greater than me, right? Like if I don't have that, then I'm always going to struggle finding somebody to make sense. And it's very possible that I'll find myself trying to become what they want instead of being who I was designed to be, and this relationship just easily making sense in the long run, because no one has to change who they are, meaning I don't have to leave my values, I don't have to leave my identity, who God has made me to be, who I am, in order to accommodate you. Yes, there's change that takes place in my life always for the better of the relationship and the better of the connections, but I don't have to abandon my values to get there. And I think there's a lot of people who are going about searching for this person wrong, because maybe you think that there's just one person God designed for you, which again is a shaky paradigm. Or maybe you have a lot of self-sabotaging thoughts, and there could be a plethora of things, fears and worries, anxieties, those kinds of things. But it's just something to think about. I really want to know what I'm assigned to do in this life before I make a declaration of trying to make room for another human being into my life, because it's possible that if I don't know that and I just go ahead and create a relationship with somebody, it's possible that I end up that relationship doesn't end up being what I hope for it to be, because then we begin going in opposite directions, and it's always a tug and pull, and no one is really able to get to where they're called to be. And so now you begin to either consider settling and in a lot of ways abandoning your calling, which isn't beneficial, or you have to end the investment that you've put into the relationship for however long it's been. And I think a lot of thinking needs to go into that. So I love those thoughts. Let's just finish this up, and then I got a couple more thoughts to give you on vulnerability specifically at the end.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the whole game of dating and relationships, is what kind of person you actually want. Whatever society is telling you is attractive, or whatever your friends are telling you is attractive, you can find someone who makes you incredibly happy, and your friends are like, really?
I don't get it.
Like, I don't really. Like, and that, unless you have a strong sense of self and of what you're looking for, that could throw you off. That could make you go, oh yeah, you're right, I guess this person isn't great. But 5 minutes ago, you thought they were awesome because they were right for you. And okay, fine. If there's a guy that's kind of like that won't show emotion and doesn't need to indulge emotions and whatever, that's okay. But if you're a woman dating that guy, you better be damn sure that you don't want the kind of relationship that has a lot of emotional intimacy. That's really what it comes down to. When you talk about a guy like that, I go, that's a guy I'd never be close friends with, because I'm not like that. I'm like I'm a crier. I'm someone who I cry at everything.
Weeper.
Yeah,
Oh,
I am.
weeper.
But that's who I
Same.
am. And so I like being. Oh, if you look at the pattern of all of my male friendships, they're all people that we can sit together one-on-one and have really meaningful, open, vulnerable conversations.
Yeah.
So if you're a woman looking for that, as a man, I know I'm looking for that. If you're a woman looking for that, then you have to look at that from the beginning and say, have I seen any evidence in the first 3 weeks of the fact that I'm talking with someone who can relate on that level?
Yeah.
Or is it just someone who's hot and successful and charismatic or whatever? And I've said on the eligible bachelor test, this person ticks every box, because that's a big thing. There's a big thing around, oh, they're super eligible. And then you have to step back and go, what does that mean? When you say they're eligible, a lot of the time when someone says someone's eligible, they mean that they're single, that they're age appropriate, that they are successful, or at the very least are successful in their world or in whatever they do, and that they're attractive. That's what eligible means. None of those things, barring being able to take care of oneself, none of those things have any bearing on how great the relationship's going to be. And yet people in early dating invest based on these markers of eligibility, and it blinds them to all of these things they don't have, like, for example, emotional vulnerability or communication.
It may not be a bad reflection on you that they were unable to receive your vulnerability. It is possible that they just weren't developed yet to receive it to such a capacity, and that they actually just didn't have room to take that in. And anybody, as I agree with Matthew Hussey, anybody who is not able to take on that vulnerability, I really don't think is genuinely ready for a relationship, because there could be some levels of thinking where you're expecting this person to have it all together. You're expecting this person to be something that maybe they aren't. And there's a lot of struggle with that. And I think any relationship that is healthy and any relationship that is beneficial to continuously build has a level of vulnerability that, again, grows and grows and grows, and it grows over time. It may not be something that is as strong up front, but it's something you work at. It's something you work to. But to not have emotional availability through vulnerability in a relationship, I do think will always spell a struggle. And so, to the young men who are watching this, listen, if you have been crushed by somebody because you were vulnerable to them, I really do think that it's not a reflection on you, as in you are no longer valuable. You're no longer somebody that someone is interested in. It doesn't make you weak. It doesn't make you a beta male. Like, we got to get rid of these cultural terms, man. I really do think that that's actually what is deteriorating the minds of young people, young men today, in culture today. You're so caught up in not wanting to be called something that is looked at upon culture as a bad term and bad label. We're so wanting to be called alpha that will take on a cultural's perspective on what it means, instead of actually being rooted in truth. And so we revert from those places. And I think here's some things to keep in mind as you are growing into this space and you're getting back to this space where you're learning to be vulnerable again. You definitely want to be mindful of the people that you're being vulnerable with. And a part of that is understanding who this person is, being around this person enough. Sometimes it takes time to get back into that space of vulnerability. Not every relationship kicks off right with all of that happening up front. Sometimes it can, and other times it takes time, right? Because people have been betrayed in some aspect, have a view of relationships where maybe it's not that easy to trust others, and it's not that easy to just take you at your word, right? And so you want to ease into those spaces, which is completely understandable. But you want to be mindful of who it is you're sharing, and you want those safe spaces to be created. And I think oftentimes some of the easier ways, even though it's not necessarily easy in and of itself, but maybe I should say one of the quicker ways to do such is being vulnerable yourself. Now, that doesn't mean share the deepest things about you. It doesn't mean to come out the woodworks and share all your scars and all of your struggles. It could just be sharing something that is simple, something that they didn't know, something you were willing to share with them that maybe they didn't even ask for. You don't mind letting other people know this about you. I think that's a really cool thing to do, and see what they do with that. See how they respond to that, right? See how they, their body language, how they respond to you verbally. Pay attention to the mannerisms that you might catch on to over the course of more conversations that you share with this person, just to see how they're taking that information you gave them. And depending on how they took it, that can also lead you to say, okay, maybe I can share a little bit more with this person, or maybe that's all I need to share with this person, right? And so you're observing that, you're being very observant. You're not really rushing to tell your entire story up front. Second thing is also being able to be vulnerable with yourself. We talk a lot about being vulnerable with others, but it's hard to be vulnerable with others when you are not able to be vulnerable with yourself. And one of the quicker ways to do that, if you ask me, is actually through journaling. I'm a huge fan of journaling, not just journaling to journal and to write, but because there's great purposes behind it, great reflections, reflecting over my day, doing heart checks and really analyzing my emotions, what's on my mind, being able to locate myself. Where am I? How am I feeling? Right? What's going on around me? I'm able to do those things on a daily basis to get an awareness of potentially what is triggering these emotions, where are these emotions coming from, and then being able to dilute and get to a resolution regarding those emotions, and not necessarily acting on them or impulsively responding to them just because it's how I feel, right? And I think that is huge. So be willing to be vulnerable with yourself, right? Get into a space, make it a daily routine, make it a daily habit to write out, hey, this is how I'm feeling today. How am I feeling today? Why am I feeling this way today, right? And the more and more that you put practice and reps into that, I think the more and more you're able to not only be honest, open, and transparent with yourself, but as a result, you're going to be able to create environments like that around you where other people are going to be able to be benefited from those things as well. So I think being vulnerable with yourself, analyzing your emotions, don't move with judgment towards them, right? I shouldn't feel this way. I shouldn't feel this way. No, if that's how you feel, that's how you feel. Now we have to get an understanding on why, right? So we write those things out, we get an understanding on that, and we grow from there. That helps us be more honest about where we are, helps us to be honest towards others, being mindful of who you're vulnerable with. I think that's huge. And also recognize too that there is a space of context and relevancy to what you're being vulnerable about. I'm not going to go on an outing with somebody and we're having a great time, and all of a sudden I just blurt out how I lost a family member that was near and dear to me. We definitely want to be relevant with the conversation we're having. It's not to say that you can't share that, and it's not to say that sharing that is off limits. There's just a time and a place where that can be shared, where you can actually get some beneficial, maybe responses, guidance, and even just a listening ear to what you're sharing. So you definitely want to be relevant with what you're saying. You want to be honest. You want to be very authentic in it. And it's just being able to pick and choose the right spaces and times to do such. So you want to be mindful of that, be mindful of that when you're carrying conversations with others. Be mindful of who it is you're sharing these things with, and be mindful and aware, growing in emotional intelligence and availability through, I think, simple things as journaling, simple things as sharing what's on your mind to others around you, close friends and close circles. Those are really helpful too. But here's a couple of scriptures I want you to keep in mind too regarding vulnerability, because I think it's huge here. And it's two things. One, Jesus is our greatest example. Okay. When it comes to vulnerability, there's a couple of things that Jesus does that we can think of off rip that Jesus really, really just sets the tone for vulnerability. One, he weeps. John chapter 11, Jesus is at the tomb of Lazarus, John 11:35, which reads, Jesus wept. And shortest verse, I believe, in scripture, shortest verse in scripture, and yet so profound, because it really shows that Jesus experienced the human experience, and he felt a lot of things that we felt. He felt it all. He is the most relatable person ever, because he's experienced it, barring sin. Jesus didn't go off and hide, go into a private place. He actually allowed grieving emotions to show in front of these people before he eventually called Lazarus out of the grave, which we all knew he had the power to do the whole time. But it was such a relatable moment. And I think for us to think that you crying isn't manly, or you crying is weak, or you showing emotion is weak, I think we need to recalibrate that, because Jesus is the greatest example that is always in front of us. And he is both lion and lamb, right? And so he's the greatest example. And so we definitely want to keep that in mind. So Jesus weeps. That's number one. He's an example there, showing emotion, and it ought to allow us to be free in the sense of showing our emotion and allowing emotions to be something that's seen of others, because it helps others see how human we are. And it's also a freeing way to even get on the road to clarity and healing and things of that sort that we might need to continue moving forward. So Jesus weeps. But then I also want you to see this specific text, John chapter 20. On the evening of the first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. This is after Jesus' resurrection. The disciples are in the upper room. They're afraid of the Jews, right? They just took out our master. Who knows what they're going to do to us? And Jesus has resurrected. He walks through the doors. Doors were locked. He just walks through the doors. And not only does he announce himself, but even him going further to reveal his wounds. It proves a few things. It proves the legitimacy of everything Jesus has said up to this point. It proves that he is who he says he is. It's evidence, right, that he is alive, right? And that it was actually him, right? Because of the wounds in his hands from him being nailed to the cross and taken down and the entire crucifixion deal. But here's what's so beautiful about this is that Jesus answers in a lot of unsettling thoughts that the disciples have in this room. In this context, we can see that there's a lot of fear. Okay. Here's the same verse 19, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders. So there's a lot of thoughts that are going on in the disciples' minds. And Jesus seems to calm all of that by revealing his wounds. And so I think there's something to be said when it comes to revealing wounds, revealing hurts, revealing past pains, and telling your story, telling your testimony, even that is so profoundly necessary, even for others who may not even say anything around you and yet can be impacted by the story you tell. And I think that shares a lot. And Jesus leads here as a response of seeing these wounds. Not only are all their questions that are in their minds that they possibly never spoke are answered, but now they have life again. They have life again. They now feel they can walk out those doors and do anything now, right? So it's almost like a night and day difference in this text between how they're feeling before Jesus walks in the room and how they're feeling after Jesus reveals his wounds. Number two, Jesus revealed his wounds to those who were closest to him. And I think that's a good key to keep in mind too. Now, remember, disciples, followers of Yahweh, the way, right? Disciples of Jesus, those who have made the decision to lay down their vision in life, to pick up the vision in life that Jesus has for them. These individuals who are closest to him, who ultimately will become apostles. And this has less to do with the name and has more to do with the decision in life that the person is living. They are choosing to be with Jesus, have relationship with Jesus. Those who are in close proximity to us are those who we ought to be most vulnerable with, because those who are in close proximity have the most understanding about us. And in some cases, depending on where they fall in the relationship circles for you, how close or far they are people that we can actually depend on to not just be open with, but also get guidance with, right? And so, of course, that's for us. We know in this context, Jesus just reveals his wounds to his disciples, but I just think that that's powerful in its own self. Jesus reveals his wounds to those who were closest to him, that being the disciples, of course, barring Judas, who had betrayed Jesus and then went and deleted himself. There is something to be said about those who are in proximity to you, those who you allow closest to you, those who you allow in your circle, that you are able to then expose and share those wounds due to the journey of relationship that you've created with this person, the genuine and authenticity, the relevancy, all of those things that do play a role in the vulnerability that you share. And so it kind of goes back to the context. It kind of goes back to the picture of maybe not being vulnerable with everybody, right? Because people will have a way of trying to use that vulnerability against you. And so we want to be mindful of that. And so this is why the closeness of relationship is necessary. The proximity of relationship is necessary. And I also want to say that I think it's important, there are some relationships that you'll create where time is necessary, repetition is necessary. And there's some relationships that you'll create where the value is immense from jump. And I think that's a beautiful thing as well. But that vulnerability is something that's earned over time, and I do think that you can use your vulnerability as your superpower, as our beloved Tim Ross would do. And I think that's a beautiful thing. But not everybody is for you when it comes to the vulnerability you share. And so it's something to be mindful of, but it isn't something to lean on as a reason to be afraid of being vulnerable, because then I don't think we'll ever progress in creating genuine, meaningful relationships in our lives. And that's actually hurting us more than we're ever thinking we're doing ourselves a favor. And so don't use your past experiences of where you were crushed due to your vulnerable sharing as a means to then no longer choosing to be vulnerable with others, because I think we have to just zoom out and take into consideration that it's possible that individual was not ready for the vulnerability that you gave them. And it's possible that that person wasn't really genuinely looking for what they said they were looking for, as Matthew Hussey alludes to there. But I think that vulnerability is amazing. Vulnerability is necessary. Vulnerability is something that we all should want to create in our relationships, and we want to use wisdom. And a part of using that wisdom in our vulnerability is understanding that we need to be vulnerable with ourselves, because that's the best way that we can then in turn be vulnerable with others. Because if we're being honest, there's a lot of people who are unable to be vulnerable with others because they can't be vulnerable with themselves. And our vulnerability has the capacity to run people away. And I do think at the same token that people who run away due to our vulnerability probably aren't people who were ever really truly assigned to our lives. I think that's something to consider. Something that I would suggest and submit to you is that it's possible that people who run away due to us sharing our vulnerability with them is possibly someone who wasn't ever really assigned to our life in this season, or to the capacity in which we need to attain and have vulnerability around us to get to where we're going. Okay. So keep that in mind, wisdom in being observant, being mindful, okay, and know that there are certain places where this vulnerability can take place and be shared. There's context, there's relevancy, and we just want to be mindful of those things. But ultimately, as we shared in John chapter 11 and 20, Jesus is a great example of vulnerability, and I think he needs to be the standard for why we ought to be vulnerable, and then learn from what Jesus does to then create spaces of vulnerability. We're asking questions, we're moving in curiosity, but we're also creating spaces, inner circles, people that we're around who are in close proximity, that we know we can have a safe space to share what's on our heart and mind and have meaningful, beneficial, transformative conversations that lead to transformative relationships around us, vulnerability being a huge part. So don't allow what somebody did to you in the past to keep you from being vulnerable. I think there's so much power in being vulnerable, moving in vulnerability. And I think it's just something to keep in mind, that maybe they just weren't developed for that. And that's something that maybe we move too fast on, so we can take accountability for that. And it's something to be more mindful of moving forward into the relationships that we create. So if you guys like this kind of content, be sure to subscribe, like this video, share it with a friend who also has maybe thoughts, questions, and curiosities on vulnerability, and maybe how we should navigate them even in dating relationships, and of course relationships beyond that around us in our lives. And I appreciate you guys so much for tuning in. And until our next conversation, be easy and be breezy, my friend. Hey, peace.